right,
Good
so
morning.
here we are. Customarily, where this is one of our live sessions that would be done at the Crystal Palace at the Javits Center in New York City. Well, guess what? We're not there, as you can tell by a simple glaze around the room. However, all of the experts that we customarily have with us, we have had the opportunity and the privilege to speak with again. Doug, welcome back. And we got Eric Langer, and he is the president and managing partner of BioPlan Associates. And we're going to be talking about the continuous bioprocessing today. It's interesting, just so at a sort of a point of interest, that we're going to have several discussions on continuous process, most of which are on the solid dosage form, which Doug is going to be able to do a contrast on. That's a session we got coming up. We're also going to be talking again with our biosimilars group, which I'm sure people who have listened to this live session before have listened to that, and there's a significant amount of information is going to be discussed on bioprocess, and that session will also be recorded and available. But for today, what we're going to do is we're going to get started here. And so, Eric, my first question I got is, people, Doug and I were talking before we started. I mean, I have a pretty good sense of, solid dosage forms. So bioprocess, I mean, that's a mystery to a lot of people to begin with. So let's talk about what's expectations what do you think is going to happen here with the bioprocessing continuous? Put that in perspective for us.
Well, that's a real good question, and we've been looking at continuous bioprocessing through our analysis over the last literally 30 years, evaluating this industry segment. And over the last 17 years, we've been looking at it through our annual report that we provide every year on the industry. So we've got a lot of data on the novel technologies that are coming out in bioprocessing in particular. Obviously, continuous bioprocessing has been around for literally centuries, or rather, continuous bioprocessing, and especially perfusion, has been around for 30 years, and it's what was one of the original processes used. So this is nothing new. The question then becomes, how can process intensification, continuous bioprocessing, be integrated in the current paradigm, which is batch processing? There are obviously, from other industries, including small molecule, there are a lot of significant benefits that we're all well aware of, starting back in the automobile industry. But when we look at what is going on in bioprocessing, it does tend to be, there was the original use of continuous bioprocessing decades ago for factor VIII and other very large fragile molecules using perfusion. But over the recent decades, it's been essentially replaced by batch processing. However, now people are looking at the technologies to determine how continuous could potentially be used in more mainstream monoclonal production, et cetera. So what we've been looking at over the last 5 or 8 years in our annual reports is, what's the adoption rate? What are the expectations? What are the hurdles and the concerns regarding continuous or process intensification versus the current batch processes? So when we look to your question, what are the general expectations? By the way, I've got notes here, so we got too much data. I can't necessarily remember it all. But so I'll just read a few of the benefits that we're picking up. The top ones are obviously going to be things like reduced cost. Manufacturing productivity is a #1 area where this industry wants to see improvements, the bioprocessing industry in particular. But there are other areas like increased productivity, which relates to reduced cost, manufacturing costs as well. But there are also other issues that people are fully aware of, like improved quality. When you're doing a continuous process, you've got greater control over your process versus a batch process. You've got reduced product variability, et cetera. So, and it really does, there are real obvious, clear advantages everybody generally agrees with. You also have issues like product flexibility, especially as the industry starts to look at the ability to use different platform or a standardized platform at different facilities or for different molecules, the ability to use a modular approach or use facility space in different ways. If you can do that, if a new technology can enable that, then what you've done is you've given yourself the ability to optimize the use of your space. And in a lot of facilities, space utilization is really critical. So all of this can be sort of created through the adoption of these continuous bioprocessing technologies, and everybody generally knows it. So that's the upside. There are a lot of hurdles and so forth in adoption, and we can cover those later as well.
Let me ask you both a question, and what I'll do is I'm going to direct it at Doug, and then you jump in later, Eric, and give your spin on it. Let's face it, we're science and in this, in manufacturing. This is what all of us do. I mean, then stasis means that once the process is running, it's not stopped and start, which means you're in the state of it's nirvana. This is where you want to be. Okay, so one of the things that I'm going to ask Doug to talk about is it's always, how much am I going to have to make so that I can run this thing continuously, or how much is it going to, how do I get to that point? How do I balance continuous versus demand versus how much do I want to put into it? All right, and that's one of the things that we're faced with a lot. Companies want to be in that situation. The quality is, as you know, Eric, quality is driven, and it becomes a better place. But to get to that place, so let's just, for the sake of it, Doug, why don't we talk about how do we justify moving from to a continuous process more from a batch centric thing?
Well, so I mean, I think couple different things here. I mean, you mentioned the scale. I mean, that's an ongoing debate, still in small molecule, even with continuous being adopted there. What's the right size, right, for continuous systems? And, some people, want to do high throughput systems, and other people want really very low throughput systems. In my opinion, it's one of those things. It's not a one size fits all in terms of the industry, because for generic products, maybe some products that are long-standing, where you have a very good understanding of the market demand, it may make sense to have a larger system. But for newer products, things that you really aren't sure about where they're going in the future yet, smaller systems seem to make a little bit more sense. And one of the things about continuous is that with the higher levels of process understanding that come along with that, right? I think the key when I talk about continuous for bio as well as for small molecule is process monitoring and control, right? That's really fundamentally to me what is different between what we're doing a lot of time in batch. Not to say that there aren't exceptions, but it's the higher levels of real-time monitoring of the systems and the ability to actually control and make changes in real time if things are different than what you'd like them to be, or if you see deviations that you don't want to have, that you can control. And so with a small scale system, you can replicate those systems more easily using a continuous process than maybe in a batch process, right? You can, not only from the equipment standpoint, but also from the process control and how you're going to be able to make sure that what you're getting out of the system is similar. So, you see a lot of these new systems out there for process development, which are very small scale systems. You could think about that on a larger scale with you parallelized bioreactors running perfusion, that you'd be able to have them side by side running the same product going into a single collection in terms of what would be considered the batch. And so that's something I could see for bioprocessing. It's also something that could happen for small molecule as people look to have smaller and smaller lines, because one of the challenges that we see right now for continuous is that there is no SUPAC. There is no set scale up criteria if you want to go from one scale to another, right, like we have in legacy batch manufacturing. And so until we have that level of understanding within the regulatory domain, we're going to be able to need ways of being able to show that processes are the same. Otherwise, when you go from one scale to another, you essentially have to repeat all the process development work, and you really lose a lot of efficiency. You have a lot of lost cost there that doesn't necessarily give you any more understanding of the product. It's just demonstrating that you're getting the same thing.
Right. So Eric, so my question was, and this is something I've come across many times, and it seems that we think scale out is a name that the guys over here in small molecule came up with. It's not. I mean, I can't tell you how many times I've walked into a facility and there is a warehouse full of swirling bottles simply because they've taken the process as is and just multiplied it.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, and from what you can hear from Doug, I mean, we're still wrestling with the same questions, and it looks like bio, at least over the 10+ years I've seen it, have wrestled with those. So how did they get from scaling out and multiplying five flasks times 20? How did they get to where they've realized this is the way to do it? I mean, can you shed some light on that?
Well, I think a lot of this, when you look at the evolution of the industry, like you say, a bunch of roller bottles at an Amgen or whatever facility making EPO in warehouse scale, scaling out in that way, doesn't make a lot of sense. But the regulators back in the day, some decades ago, the regulators said, yeah, okay, use this process and it works, and we got consistency and we can get the productivity we need. It's inefficient, but it works, and everybody's making money, and nobody's essentially, from a regulatory standpoint, getting hurt. Then people start to say, well, with this new technology, using a batch process or 10,000 liter stainless or 2,000 liter plastic bags, looks like it's a much more logical, economical, and efficient way to produce the same product. People will take it on. Now people are looking at continuous and saying this essentially the same thing. How can we integrate this? So the risk with, or the challenge with continuous is its real holy grail comes when you can make it continuous from start to finish. And we're not seeing that right now. We're seeing a real discontinuity between the upstream side, where there has been, and the downstream side. So the evolution in batch processing made sense. You take a batch, you move it from point A to point B. Now in perfusion, you take a batch, or you take a process, and then you have to put it into a batch again to do the purification on it, the downstream side of it. So the real benefit would, in terms of creating that real technological leap forward, where people could actually have inputs on one side and outputs on the other, it hasn't quite evolved yet from the suppliers' R&D point of view. And that's some of the data we've collected. We've asked the end users, essentially, where do you believe the suppliers, those companies that are developing these novel technologies, where should they put their R&D money? And what we found was, generally, when we ask that kind of question, we see that it's where they feel there's an opportunity in the near term. And a number of years ago, it was pretty well, let's get the upstream side adjusted. But now when we look at this, we find that, for example, the top 5, one of the questions were, what are the top 5 areas where new technologies should be invested? And we found that, as an example, low-cost single-use devices was the number 1 area. But when we look at the 5th area, it's that was 43% of the industry saying that. 30% of the industry is saying that they want continuous downstream invested. So in other words, almost 1 in 3 of the industry are saying, we believe that we could adopt this kind of technology if it were available. So or if it were available in a format that we needed. So 30% of the industry is telling their suppliers, get on the R&D stick and come up with something. On the other hand, when we look at the downstream side of this, the number 1 area where the industry is saying they want investment is continuous downstream chromatography. 48% of the industry, nearly half of the industry, half of the people you might talk with, are saying to the suppliers, if you can fix this downstream issue, not only are you fixing the continuous bioprocessing, process flow, but you're also fixing a real bottleneck that we have today, which is their processing side of it. So we can increase the perfusion side, can increase the output, and we can get greater productivity out of the upstream side, but we still have bottlenecks on the downstream side, and that's demonstrated year on year over the last at least 7-8 years, where we see that the industry is saying our capacity constraints are coming from the downstream side. So they're saying, come up with a way, if continuous can fix that, then it's going to open a door, and people will look at it at the entire continuous concept clearly with greater interest.
Well,
But 50%
and
is already saying, come on, guys, let's see something come out.
well, and think about it. If you had that kind of solution, I mean, even if you were doing a batch bioreactor, you would still get a lot of benefit, right? I mean, being able to help with that, is a step towards the holy grail, as you put it. But you can get a lot of benefit out of these things, once they come to market and are a good solution that already does better than what you're doing right now. And certainly, I think downstream continuous chromatography would be one of those things for bio.
But isn't that one of the larger challenges? I mean, that's where you're going to have to put a lot of cash in the game as far as development goes. And that's where I'm at. I mean, from the solid side, certain parts of the continuous process, Doug, we just take it as a hit, But I think in the case of bio, you can't, because it obviates a lot of the upstream improvement. So how big of a challenge is it? I mean, Eric, what's the pushback on this? This has got to be a very costly process.
Well, and another, yes, and on the downstream side, especially in bio, the cost of a batch upstream is not so high relative. But when you've processed that, now you have your downstream product from the bioreactor, for instance, it's starting to really increase its value. So you don't want to make mistakes, and in order to ensure that the downstream side of the technology is going to be adoptable, there's got to be as obvious and foolproof technology out there made available as possible, because otherwise people are going to say, I'll just stick with what we're doing. Protein A works, centrifugation works. It ain't broke, and most importantly, the regulators love it, or they don't love it, but they don't even look at it. So if you can look at a new technology in this industry and say, hey, the regulators will look at this new technology the same as they look at the existing technology, that's a winner. So the question is here, how can you do that in a continuous environment with this kind of new technology? Can you say this is as robust and as consistent and as safe as the current technologies?
Well, and that's the kind of transition we always see with the technology, right? I mean, what you're seeing in downstream chromatography right now are, similar resins, if not the same resins that were being used, for batch processes being put into these, continuous, semi-continuous systems. People are stepping in that direction, but also at the same time trying to keep things that are familiar and well liked the same. And sometimes it's hard to have both of those in the overall most efficient system that may come in the future. And so, that's where, again, you have to admit that, it's something where people are interested in, but there's still evolution that's occurring.
So let me ask you this question. So who's actively evaluating new and emerging technologies? So, and how do the continuous technologies compare to others? Who's looking at the automation? Who's looking at the membrane? I think let's put some context around that. So Eric, why don't you lead off on that?
Okay, so the first point you made is who's actively evaluating, and we use that as a marker for identifying the strength of an existing or a future trend, because if people are evaluating it and you can demonstrate a consistent growth in that evaluation over time, that means that eventually those products that are being evaluated for new products, because nobody's going to shift for an existing product. Nobody's going to say, hey, I think we're going to go ahead and shift from our current batch technology to a continuous technology. No, it's going to all obviously be for new products coming out of the pipeline, probably at the best late stage clinical. So we're looking at how are people going to be adopting any new technology for an early stage product, which means it's the actual commercial the commercial adoption, which is what the objective of the suppliers, is going to be 5-7 years off. So I mean, this is a long timeline, but it all starts with the evaluation stage and the process development people looking at these new technologies. So we see this as a really critical element. So when we ask the question, how will your facility be evaluating continuous bioprocessing technologies over the next 12 months? It's important to look at a snapshot, but what's even more important is to see what it looks like over time. So when we look at the issues of evaluation, actively evaluating and testing, upstream technologies back in 16, something in the neighborhood of 30% were actively evaluating. It's up to 39% now, indicating that they're actively evaluating, and the data show a very consistent upward trend year on year. So that suggests to us that we're not looking at noisy data. We're looking at what's actually happening out there in terms of the process development people looking at these new technologies upstream. When we look at who's actively evaluating on the downstream side, we saw it fairly flat around 24, 26% over the last four or so 5 years. And that's because there wasn't a lot to evaluate. And that goes to the second part of your question, what's out there? As you say, we're seeing more technologies that are being introduced. So we saw an uptick as well of the percent of people that are bioprocessing professionals that are looking at the downstream side to the tune of something over 37%. So that's a fairly significant uptick in the percentage of people on the downstream side that are actively evaluating something. Now the question then is, what exactly is that something? Is it a membrane? Is it a new technology? Is it a disposable? And some of those new technologies we do capture, but I think the bigger issue is there's enough buzz out there in the industry, enough INTERPHEX meetings that are talking about these downstream technologies that cause these professionals to say, we're going to have to be looking at them, so let's go ahead and start now. And I think that's part of the reason why we're seeing that in the data.
Doug, what's your take on that?
Well, I mean, I think the most noise is coming from, some of the big name vendors. I mean, Paul has been very, out front, talking about continuous bioprocessing solutions. And then there have been some companies that have talked publicly about their forays into the technology. Merck, I've seen talk about their continuous bioprocessing a couple times, but it isn't clear, when they're going to go from that evaluation to the commercial that Eric talked about, whether they're currently on that 5 to 7 year pattern, or whether they're still looking at things this time. And I think from what I've seen, what I've heard from people, similar to what we saw in small molecule, we need to see an evolution of the technology where other things are integrated into it, where more analytics are embedded into it, or there's people get over the hump of figuring out how those analytics are going to work with those systems, have the ability to then put in process control, where the different unit operations that have been developed can work more in harmony. And so I think that that's what we'll see over the next couple years as the vendors work together, as vendors work with first adopters, and they kind of evolve the technology a little bit more, and then we can get to the point where you have a full solution that people will say, hey, this is good enough in terms of what's different about it to make me want to go out of evaluation into the actual adoption situation.
Well, I'll tell you, and Doug, correct me if I'm wrong, but the guy, in the small molecule area, I didn't see the CMO dimension coming. I mean, these guys seen the advantage, they grabbed it and they ran with it. You know what I mean? I mean, if you ask yourself who's got the most continuous process experience now, it's not going to be big pharma. It's going to be the contractors. So, you know where the next question is coming from, Eric. So the answer is on the contract side, taking, in other words, to what extent are the guys in the bioprocess evaluating that they seem to be, and again, they seem to be on the leading edge on our side of the community here. So why don't you give a little spin on that one?
Yeah, absolutely. The CMOs see so many more different processes and need to understand how the emerging processes or technologies are going to integrate into their facility in 2 to 5 or whatever years. So they need to be on the leading edge, and they understand that they're the ones that are going to need to be testing these technologies. And I've sat in on a number of advisory meetings at CMOs where enough of them to know that when these new technologies are presented, they're presented in sort of a bunch. It's a disposable bioreactors, new downstream technologies, and these presentations are made about how they compare. So they do this on an active basis. The question then is, how can a supplier of some of these new technologies actually get their their technology evaluated in front of a CMO, because let's face it, if a CMO tests something and it's working like gangbusters, they're going to be an agent for the vendors. And once something is in essentially in humans, and that may come from a contract manufacturer, then it becomes a standard. So the vendors and the innovators and the CMOs all recognize this ecosystem is really important to them. And so the CMOs are inundated frequently with new technologies daily. So the question is, how do they, with their limited process development people, filter out the ones that are going to actually succeed? And so they do become de facto, like Doug was saying, the leading edge and a proponent of some of these new technologies. So when we look at the data, we ask, we also break out the same questions so that we can identify whether or not the respondent is a CMO or a drug innovator or a biopharma. And so one of the questions we asked, regarding evaluating testing in your facility, which are you going to be evaluating in the next 12 months? Upstream continuous processing or chromatography or perfusion, rather upstream perfusion. 46% of the CMO of the 46% of the biomanufacturers are evaluating upstream stuff versus 33% of the CMOs. In other words, fewer CMOs are evaluating perfusion. And I think there's a reason why, especially when you look at the downstream side of it. What percent of the CMOs are evaluating downstream continuous technologies? And that's 53% versus only 38% of the drug innovators. In other words, the downstream side is being evaluated by CMOs to a very significantly greater degree than the upstream side. And the reason, I believe, is that the CMOs have already evaluated most of the new technologies upstream. Now, what we're seeing is the downstream side these new technologies are being presented, and the first to evaluate are often going to be the CMOs, and that's partly why I think we're seeing more than half of the CMOs out there are doing active evaluation of these downstream technologies. And that's
But I would say at the same time, the vendors still need to make sure that they're talking to the end users, in terms of the pharma companies with the products, because at least what we saw for continuous when it came to solid dose, most of the CMOs got in it by partnering with their major customers, right? Their first installations were things there was a lot of interaction and consultation with the customers that product was going to run on those lines. And so that could be the case here in bio. It could be that it'll be more of a if they build it, they will come sort of situation. But at least from what we've seen in recent years, with the major CMOs that got into it, it was by working very closely with their customers that wanted to do continuous, and it was more of a partnership in a lot of ways to get that initial capacity in place. Now, obviously, once they have the capacity and they have the experience, then it becomes a different situation where they can bring in more and more customers and allow those customers to rely on them. But in the early days, it was based off of partnerships.
Yeah, totally. The most mid-size and large customers are going to say, we'll tell our CMO what our platform is. What happens, as you know, sometimes with the smaller drug innovators, is because they don't have as much experience and they don't have manufacturing facilities, they're using a CMO. They're the ones that are going to rely on the CMO to tell them often, here's the technology that's going to have best application for your product. So agreed that because the smaller companies are going to make up maybe a larger percentage, but a larger percentage of the processes or projects. They're going to make up a much smaller percentage of the total volume because they're not going to be the large scale ones.
Let me ask you this. I mean, so continuous bioprocessing is, when you mentioned, the technology shows, the technology forums, INTERPHEX, this is where people come to find what they need. So the question really is I mean, so the question comes down to is what innovations, what are the hot ones? I mean, how does it compare to like single use? I mean, there was a while there where all you ever heard about was single-use technologies in bioprocess. Now, I mean, so has that kind of given way, or is that somehow integrated into CBP, or how does that work, Eric?
Like you're saying, there are a lot of companies out there with innovative technologies, simulated moving bed, periodic counterculture, chromatography. Some years ago, we listed in our report, it must have been 20 different technologies, especially downstream, that were emerging and continuous. But the ones, obviously a lot of these were pie in the sky. They didn't work out. So it really is narrowing itself down to some of the fewer, more critical ones. Now, is something really totally innovative out there, hiding out there? Very possibly, and you never know in this industry. It can be very exciting. You find a disruptive technology that will come and make a significant difference. Realistically, if you haven't seen it at INTERPHEX or some of the other larger meetings, the companies out there, and here's of course the challenge: some of these innovators are coming from the universities, and those university technologies, need investment, and they need valuation, and they need a sugar daddy, essentially, somebody that's going to come in and ensure that the technology gets developed. Because let's face it, if this were IT or automotive engineering, you could have a commercial product in a couple of years. Here, it could be, almost decades before somebody ultimately sees profit coming out of the actual product that was innovated in an R&D lab at a university. Doesn't mean that technology isn't going to be hugely valuable. It's just a question of the time and the time value of money associated with how somebody's going to invest it. So obviously, with this industry, valuation of those technologies by not just the suppliers who need to put it, like Paul, that need to put it into their R&D facilities and develop it. This is a hugely long process, of course, and as a result, some of the technologies that could actually be succeeding, it's not nearly as vibrant in terms of those technologies popping up in the patent and literature reviews as it would be in some other industries.
So, Doug, you should give it a pretty good spin on it coming from the university side. I mean, what do you think?
Well, I mean, what I was going to say is that, when we talk about these innovative technologies, a lot of times we're talking about, one piece of the puzzle. And if we're talking about continuous, it's really, how do all these different things come together to give you a solution? And I think, there have been some, neat innovations out there, in the last few years. And the question is, how do you bring them all together? How do you demonstrate them? And that it has been one of the things that universities have been able to do to a certain extent, is to be able to, demonstrate these integrated technologies by bringing all the different pieces together and working with, people in the industry to do demonstrations of what it would look like to, manufacture real products using these things. And so, I think that's one of the things I haven't seen with bio yet. I've seen, a lot of technology, innovation around, a piece of the puzzle. But I think, what would be good, for the industry would have, a cooperative, activity where people are seeing how this is done with an entire integrated system. And because also the thing that comes out of that is trained people that have had hands-on experience that can then go out in the industry, and they get it while they're in school. They get that kind of hands-on training. And a lot of the people working in the continuous, solid dose area, were the ones that were coming up, at the universities when that work was being done there.
So let me ask you this question. I mean, we talked about capacity, we talked about throughput. I mean, for several years there, our issue was that capacity was was kind of a stop. In other words, there was only X capacity, So obviously, I guess in terms of capacity now, in other words, assets, facilities to make product. So where does the industry put this? Is it they see that continuous process is going to be the solution to the bottleneck and capacity constraints, Eric?
Well, that's a good question. I think it may be too early to discuss continuous as the as sort of a rescuer of some of the capacity problems, partly because the current capacity problems are really focused on downstream stuff. And you know, as we talked about, the continuous bioprocessing downstream technologies aren't where they need to be. So I think we're still at that mushy point where the opinions of the industry are still, you know, it's a bit in a holding pattern, kind of a wait and see. 34% believe that, according to our data, that continuous downstream technologies could have an impact on capacity, and part of that is because people are experiencing acute pain right now at their facility with their downstream operation. So they're likely saying, if somebody's got a continuous process that can fix our capacity issue downstream, you know, let's definitely look at that and invest in it. But the reality is there's still a ways off. And to Doug's clear point, if you can't chain these pieces together, then you know, that does become a problem. Which, by the way, I wanted to mention something else, and the impact of regarding the impact of the universities and training as it relates to downstream as well as upstream perfusion technologies using continuous approaches. When we've looked at this for this particular question since 2011, so 9 years we've been asking the question, essentially, when you compare batch fed versus perfusion or continuous technologies, in which areas do you feel there's a greater concern? So, in other words, where do you have a greater concern? And there's a bunch of different areas, one of which was process operational complexity. And what we found was that starting back in 2011, 66% felt that a continuous perfusion type approach would create a much bigger or somewhat bigger challenge relative to batch process. So in other words, 2/3 of the industry are looking at operational complexity as a problem in continuous processes, and that's the number one issue. The thing that I think is important to note is that while the vendors have simplified these technologies over time, and they really have been more automated, to Doug's point about automation being a key factor in ensuring all these pieces integrate appropriately, the concern about complexity and operational complexity, which means you're going to screw up somebody, a person, a decision maker, or an operator is going to screw up a batch, which is going to cost them money and maybe their job. That hasn't gone away. The concern about complexity started off at 66%, and this year it's 80%. So 80% of the industry is saying, I'm more worried, I'm at least somewhat more worried about the complexity of a continuous process than I am about a batch. So if you're looking at, say, if a company profile, if a manufacturer's profile is, we want to make sure that we're on the regulatory safe side, we want to make sure that we're on the operational safe side, we're dealing with a bunch of operational, marginally trained people. Our people are not really up to speed. They don't know how to, integrate their, or take their knowledge and put it into a new application. Then they're going to want to stick with what's tried and true. Going to something that's operationally complex, like some of these continuous technologies, is not going to be part of their mix until the vendors start to demonstrate that not only is it cheaper, faster, better, more consistent, but it's easier because we've taken the complexity out of it by automating everything. Punch a button, the machine does the work. Once you're at that point, and that's, by the way, where a lot of the innovators or the suppliers and vendors are moving, is how do we make these things not just more technologically simple, but operationally foolproof. So once they get to that point, then this issue will go from 80% back down to where it should be.
Well, yeah, and that's always the case. I mean, you have to have the right people, and when it comes to operations versus development, there's always been a difference there. And even if you hit the button, to get something to work, you got to make sure that you have people within the organization that understand it to the full extent to be able to put the filings together, right, to be able to, talk about what the technology is actually doing. And so I think, we come back to the, the need for training and making sure that, people understand the technology, that's not a black box, that we're able to, communicate effectively around what the technology is supposed to be doing and how it's doing it.
And hiring today for this industry is the #1 concern they have. When we look at the data, if there's going to be a bottleneck, it's going to be the result of people not being able to hire the right people to be able to produce a product at the level that the regulators are looking for.
Right. I have to say again, in my consulting capacity, I've come across, and this is on small molecule and bioprocess, I found that in several cases they had a chemical engineer running the process, which, coming from conventional small molecule, is a far cry from where, the basis of our workforce is. So yeah, I think that's a paradigm. That is definitely going to be a paradigm shift. I mean, this is, let's face it, we're talking about complexities beyond most people's understanding. So I think Doug's right. I think we're going to depend on the university to train them, and we're going to depend on people hiring them. And I can see why the concerns are. Right. Let me ask this. So, all right, we're kind of. So, if I was on a project team, right, and this is pretty much how we make the decisions, right? In a project team, we look at the technology, we look at marketing, we look at the patient, it's a cross-functional stuff. And I got to tell you, continuous is never usually part of the discussion. So, from your sense, and I'll open it with Doug. I mean, from your, let's say, where should that dialogue start? Should it start in early phase? Where should it start, Doug?
Well, I typically said, it's got to start where you can get the short-term benefits. And so, when you're talking about running, either batch or perfusion bioreactors, to me, it comes down to, taking a look at those instances where you've had, failures, and figuring out what kind of analytics that you can put in place to, be able to avoid that, right? And as people become more comfortable with using, what would be considered advanced technology around, real-time monitoring, you can then start to talk about, well, there's other technology solutions that work, even better with this real-time monitoring, and we can link these things together, and we could talk about a closed loop system here that's going to be able to not only monitor but then make the changes, and you can evolve in that fashion. But I think one of the challenges that Continuous has had is that when you're talking about a big integrated system with a lot of different pieces, it normally has a pretty big price tag. It's not like, bringing in one new unit operation and trying things out. And, sometimes from an organizational perspective, figuring out how you can start to move in that direction and maintain benefit throughout the transition is really a key aspect to making sure people stick with it. Because, there's been times where people, jump in and, start spending a lot of money. And if you can't show that benefit, sometimes the plug gets pulled. And I think, unless you have a real organizational commitment, to the technology, if you try to go too hard, too fast, it doesn't always have the same success as having a real, strategy in terms of how you're going to get into this over the long term and make sure you show benefit to your organization as you do that.
So, Eric, I mean, at least where I come from, it's a long-term strategy. I mean, there is, and this is why I'm going to ask, I mean, the industry as a whole, at least in certain cases, at least on the small molecule side, they've decided that this is truly an option that needs to be pursued. It's not, gee whiz, I've got this, now I'm going to switch over to continuous. I'm sure that's the majority of what happens. But how does it get integrated into the fabric of product development from your standpoint? What kind of feedback do you have on that?
Well, I think we can start by looking at what's actually happened over time here. And while the concept of continuous is, I think, very, very attractive, the reality of who's done it recently and how many facilities have actually implemented tends to be very low. I mean, we're talking at a handful of facilities using either up or downstream facilities at any kind of commercial level. Most of which are, like I mentioned, for things like factor 8, where they have very large molecules that require this kind of a perfusion approach. So I think the reality is going to be that at present, according to our studies, something in the neighborhood of 5% of bioreactors tend to use perfusion. Most are for feeder, not for production bioreactors. And much of the adoption is going to continue for perfusion alone, is going to continue to be for small and mid-scale, early-stage companies, and not the large facilities where obviously you're going to have higher volume and higher value. So I think to your point about when you're in those conversations with people and continuous doesn't come up, I think that's a data point that suggests, yes, the reason it doesn't come up is because it's not coming up. So the big question then is when will it start to come up, and to what extent can we expect this to move into next, more mainstream classic manufacturing technologies for new molecules? And I think the answer there is as Doug was saying, when the pieces all start to come together, and when the technologies are simplified enough that people can look at this as a scale-up option, so that it's not just a bolt-on, seed feeder bioreactor kind of an approach, but rather, yeah, this works at a small scale because it's useful. When we scale up, now when the technology exists that we can now scale it up to a commercial scale, then people are going to say, yeah, well, let's go ahead and put this on our drawing board for our manufacturing commercialization strategy, assuming we get our technologies out of clinical scale into a larger scale. Then we're going to need to know that whatever continuous process we have is actually scalable, which goes to, that's the underlying premise in most manufacturing strategy, is if this isn't scalable, the process development people are going to say, yeah, we can use this at this level for these kinds of applications, but it'll never move into the into our strategy to the extent that we can expect it to be a commercial scale, because we don't see evidence that this technology can scale. And that's not just continuous, it's virtually everything. If it can't scale up or down, and by the way, downscaling is becoming, and testing and evaluation on the downscaling side is becoming equally as important for new technologies. If people can't take it from a 10-liter scale down to a milliliter scale, it means that they can't do their testing and optimization on it. So that's not as important as upscaling it, but it's becoming equally as critical for new technologies that are being launched or evaluated.
So Doug, thanks, Eric. I mean, we're kind of getting down to the wire here, but Doug, I got a question. Actually, it's a statement. See where you're coming from on. You and I have talked about this several times, and I think part of the continuous process thing, no matter if it's bio, small molecule, whatever, is to get the term scale out of it. In other words, you come up with a process, and what it turns out to be is if you run the process X number of hours versus X number of minutes, how that's how you decide. In other words, but the question is going to come down to is how long does it take to get it into stasis? In other words, you just come in and turn on the lights. So what's your take on that, Doug?
Well, I mean, I think the term that we often use when we're talking about continuous is throughput, which is really the scale per unit time, right? Because you may have two systems that are fundamentally the same, but one does 3 times the amount of the other system for the same amount of unit time, and it really just comes down to how much can the vendors make in terms of variations on the same product line, what is the customer demand for different throughputs, and what kind of products are out there in terms of needing a system to be able to meet the market demand. Again, like we said before, you could potentially scale out, but that's not always people's first thought or the way that they want to do things within their organization. And so I think that you will see some custom large scale systems around the same design concept for very large well established products. And in other cases you need to have those ones, as Eric said, that are more scaled down and more nimble in terms of different products coming through the pipeline and maybe their scale going down or going up, and you're not sure yet based off of competition and performance within the market.
So Eric, having said all of this, let's wrap this up by saying, okay, where do you see like 5, 8 years, 10 years out where's the industry going to be? I mean, everybody going to be jumping on board here or on continuous? Where do you see it? Look in the crystal ball, Eric, and let us have
That's harsh. That's harsh. Yeah, this is I think it's a dynamic area. I think the big thing about it is that the industry recognizes that continuous is a logical progression, and it's not a new thing. So whether it's upstream or downstream, the question is going to be, like Doug was saying, how and when will it be integrated, and how and when will the automation systems allow it to be used in a way that's that's capable of being used multiple platforms and multiple facilities, so allow it to be transportable essentially. When that happens, I think we're going to see greater investment and in the R&D and greater launch. So is that going to happen? As we said, everything takes 5 years. Is that going to happen in 5 years? Well, if we see these occur right now, then yeah. But realistically, is it 5 or 10 years before we're seeing continuous as an integrated system? That would be my prediction. I wouldn't put money on 5 years, but I would. But 5 years is a short timeline in bioprocessing.
Yep. So, Doug, where do you see it?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with that. I mean, I think 5 years, there could be systems out there capable. It doesn't mean that they've been adopted yet. Because there's a lot of different pieces that have to come together, not just on the hardware side, but like we said, also in terms of personnel, in terms of the companies being at the point where they're have a product that's ready to go on it. I personally think another key is figuring out how your strategy from the development standpoint, meshes up with, what you think of continuous from the, full scale commercial. Because if you can get to the point where you're seeing benefits out of being able to do process development faster or some other benefit that, can really, pay back into the organization, then you'll see, I think, increased interest. We saw that with small molecule when people realized they could develop processes a lot faster using a continuous system. That's where there was a major uptick in people saying, okay, we got to figure out how we're going to get our organization, around this. What do we need to do in terms of getting the right people in to be able to adopt this? Because, speed to market, is one of those things that, is going to be important regardless of what the product is, because that's more time that you're in the marketplace able to generate revenue. And so I think, continuous, bioprocessing may be that, but there's a lot of other things that people are doing around, trying to do rapid screening, rapid development. And so, it's going to be a competition between those different technologies. And, it's not clear how much continuous bioprocessing brings that advantage relative to the way people are currently doing development today with, small scale bioreactors.
Well, I want to thank you guys. This is one of those discussions I think that we should have on a yearly basis, because it looks like there's going to be a lot of progress made. INTERPHEX Live actually does, in fact, use some ongoing discussions in these areas where we want to show the progress. And I know this continuous bioprocess has been one of the hot topics here, especially in light of the ongoing personalized medicine and these other concepts that people have been pushing forward. However, that's all the time we have today. I want to thank you guys very much, and that's it. That's a wrap.